There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
It's always especially exciting to welcome a brand new guest to Bite Size Book Chat. So I would like to welcome Robin joining us today from Delaware. Hello, Robin.
Hello, Sean. How are you today?
Good. Have you ever been on a train with Joe Biden?
No, but I've seen him at the beach riding his bicycle. Likes ice cream downtown.
Robin is here to tell us about a novel that I've been interested in ever since I first heard about it. It was published in May this year. It is called The East Indian by Brinda Charry.
Yes, it is.
There it is with a beautiful cover.
Yes, absolutely gorgeous.
It's the author's American debut. She has published books. I'm not sure what kind of books, but she has published books in India. She is a Indian American writer. Robin, tell us, what's the opening premise? How does the book begin?
Well, it begins with this young boy, Tony. Tony is a product. He is from India. His mother was Indian and his father was English from the British East Indian Trading Company. And they had his mother and his father had a little affair, and he was the product, but his father brings him to London, and that's where we start. He's about 9 years old, and his life in India, and he's then kidnapped by a merchant to come to America, which was not the United States yet. It was early colonial. Apparently, it was very common for young children to be kidnapped because for as many people as you brought over to do labor, you received land. So that's what happened to him. He was kidnapped and brought to Virginia, near the Jamestown colony, to become sort of like an indentured servant.
Is any of this based on historical fact?
Yes, actually, Brinda Charry, the author, is also a Shakespeare scholar. And in one of Shakespeare's plays, Midsummer Night Dream, there's reference to an Indian boy. The reference was, if I'm correct, quoting, the boy was stolen from an Indian king. And she became fascinated by that story and she did research. And in fact, there is a brief record of a boy in the same situation coming to America and the Virginia area. There's not much else. That was pretty much it. We don't know what happened to him. But she took the mention in the play, that research that she found, and then subsequently in later years, there were quite a few other East Indian people coming to the States. Her claim is, Europe was so multicultural at the time that it wasn't unusual to have people from India and other countries. So she used all that plus her Shakespeare experience to pull all that together.
It sounds like quite a plotty novel, lots of adventure and lots of action.
Yes, it is, because Tony, the children he comes over with, they become friends, other friends that come and go. America at that time, it was very primitive and rough, so their life was not easy, and so that also contributed to a lot of adventures, troubles, and it just really brought him to who he was at the end of the book. His English father taught him to read and write, so he had a skill that a lot of adults in America at that time didn't have. So he became an apprentice to a doctor, mostly in herbal medicine at that time, because doctors in the Americas at that time were very rare and far and few between. So
how far, we're not going to talk about what happens at the end of his life or at the end of the book, but how far do we get into his life, into his old age or middle age?
About 20. About 20.
Okay. Right.
And I am not going to mention the ending, but based on it, I'm really hoping she maybe writes another book about picking up there.
Oh, there's a place she could pick up and run with in a sequel.
I hope so. I'm hoping.
Interesting. So part of the inspiration for this character, Tony, comes from Midsummer Night's Dream, the Shakespeare play.
Mm-hmm.
Does that play actually form part of this story?
Yes, I think there are parallels because in the play, this is a young boy in the woods, and of course, coming to America, it's wooded, and he's out in I'm not going to say rural. It's worse than that. It's just unknown territory, rough and ready, and it's woods. So she does parallel the play in the environment and the landscape.
Why did you like this book so much, Robin?
Number one, I like the idea of challenging the story out there that America is white, because I think we had a lot of everybody here, but mostly because she's a Shakespeare scholar, the writing made me feel I was reading in the flow of Shakespeare. It's not his speech, it's just the sort of the music of her writing. I enjoyed that. And the character, Tony, she just created this wonderful young boy, and just it was beautiful, beautiful. I actually got to meet her at a book gathering and hear her speak, and so you get the background of her book and herself too, so that was good.
Oh, that's great. Well, I was interested in this book. Just really the cover caught my eye. The fact that this is about non-white, early multiculturalism, if I can put it that way, in
Yes.
America or in North America, that interests me. But you have really sold me on it. And so thank you, Robin, so much for telling us
Well,
about the
you're
book.
welcome.
And I'd like to welcome back for his second appearance, Rowan, joining us from Tasmania in Australia. Welcome back, Rowan. How are you?
Thank you very much, Sean. It's really good to be back.
Yeah, well, you've been doing a heck of a lot of interesting readings since the last time you were here. So I've nabbed you, snagged you, snatched you back for another appearance, because one in particular that has one of the highest Goodreads rating of any book that I've ever seen. Right now, it's got a 4.67 star rating on Goodreads. It's a 2024 debut novel called Depth of Field by Kirsty Iltners.
Yes.
Tell us about this book, Rowan.
Yes, well, it's Kirsty's debut novel, and it was winner of the 2023 Dorothy Hewitt Award, which is a literary prize here in Australia. And it kind of focuses on two alternating perspectives, one of which is a character called Tom, who is a middle-aged photographer, just kind of going through the motions of life, really, in a dead-end relationship, kind of drinking plenty of wine and stuff like that. And also from the other perspective of a teenage single mother called Lottie, who lives above a fish and chip shop with her baby daughter Coral, and it kind of explores some of the challenges of her life that you would probably find accustomed to that of young mothers. They're both two isolated individuals, and kind of explores that and a bit about identity, belonging, and themes along those lines.
And unless it's a spoiler to answer this question, I have a question, which is, do these two people cross paths at some point in the novel?
I don't feel like I can say anything
Okay,
about
well,
that.
that in and
I
of
have to
itself
admit,
makes it all the more interesting.
yeah, I kept wondering if they would for a large portion of the novel. But yeah, there are some twists and turns towards the end that I think are probably just best read and experienced for the reader.
I get it totally. Where is it set? Is it set in a specific place in Australia?
Yeah, so it's set in Queensland, I believe, where Kirsty, the author, is from.
Okay.
And yeah, I know that Tom, the male character there, lives in a kind of traditional Queenslander type house, like those old kind of wooden houses that are on kind of raised above the ground that are quite common for the Queensland area. So definitely has that Queensland kind of feel about it.
That's great. So this is a novel published in Australia, and those are often difficult to get outside of Australia, but I have checked, and you can get it at least on Amazon.com in paper and on Kindle. So it is at least available there. And there's a lot to do with photography in the book. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, there is. So it has a very unique framing device, I feel the book has, in that the chapter headings kind of represent values on what they call the exposure triangle, I think, in photography. So on the exposure triangle, they kind of gradually move along, which make the image clearer. And so it kind of is a parallel to that, in that as the story goes along, they change, and eventually the story itself becomes clearer as more is revealed about the characters and their lives and the different bits and pieces. So I've never come across that before, but it was a really unique way of telling the story. I felt, yeah, it really kind of set it apart from previous books I've read.
And so it sounds like we're talking literary fiction here.
Yeah, definitely. I would describe it as literary fiction. Tom, the middle-aged man in there, he's a real estate photographer, and so we kind of follow him going about his job, attending houses that are listed for sale, and kind of getting an insight into the lives of the occupants in those houses, and meeting some of the owners and things like that. He's kind of seems a little bit disillusioned with that, and he's often pining or reminiscing about a past relationship, which seems to drive a lot of his kind of going through the motions of life, I guess you could say.
How would you describe the tone of this novel, Rowan?
There is definitely some melancholy there. I feel like there's certainly some hope as well, but definitely some melancholy, as, I mean, they're really quite two isolated people trying to keep their head above waters in various ways. Different obstacles in each of their lives, but yeah, definitely some melancholy, but also some hope, which I quite enjoyed that aspect too, because I feel like without that little glimmer of hope, some books can kind of get quite down after a while, which I find kind of can rub off on me if I'm reading too many of those books. But yeah, it had some great themes, I feel.
And it sounds to me like it's more of a character-driven novel than a plot-driven
Yeah,
book.
definitely two wonderful character studies, I feel,
Yeah.
that really kind of complemented each other.
The title, Depth of Field, is very apropos. Is there anything that you want to say about the cover? Yeah, it's quite a striking photograph there.
It is. I think it reflects the novel enough without giving anything away
Okay.
whatsoever, which, yeah, is really cool.
Well, I'm sold, Rowan. Thanks for telling us about it, and I hope you come back.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much for having me, Sean. It's been great chatting.
It's always exciting to welcome a new guest to Bite Size Book Chats, and so I would like to welcome Beck, joining us from Fridland area in the States. They have a booktube channel that is really interesting to me because it's called Mooney Reads, and my name is Sean Mooney. So hello, Beck. Welcome to my channel.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's so nice to meet you, and you've got a friend there.
Yes, she likes to be involved. Yeah. Anytime I'm on the
That's
phone with somebody or talking, she's here.
that's awesome. So tell us what you do over on your channel and on Instagram, Beck.
Yeah, so I mostly just talk about books. I tend to read a lot of queer books across genres. I also tend to read probably a little bit more nonfiction than some other booktubers. I think my reading ends up being about a third or more nonfiction, and I like to talk about those too. I tend to have little kind of rabbit holes that I'll follow a lot of the way down with my nonfiction.
And so we're recording this chat at the very end of November. So I'm going to take a wild guess. You've been happily participating in Nonfiction November.
Yeah, definitely. I'm in the middle of quite a few things, and I've been really most of my reading this month has been audiobooks, which I'm a kind of moody reader, both in terms of format and just the books in general. So I have to be in the right kind of headspace for audiobooks. So yeah, a lot of memoirs recently, a little bit of fiction too, even though it doesn't really fit in. But surprisingly, I think some of the fiction that I've read has kind of fit into nonfiction November because there's either a nonfiction element or it's kind of like meta in a certain way. But
It's fun to pair a nonfiction and a fiction together, actually. Yeah, when it's possible to do. Well, we are going to talk about a nonfiction book, and I think this is the first book that's about of language and writing and grammar and vocabulary that I've ever featured on my bite-sized book series. But it's totally up my alley. It's called Like Literally, Dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English by Valerie Fridland, published in April this year. And I noticed that you posted about it on Instagram, and here we are. So, Beck, tell us about this book.
yeah, so here it is. I actually initially listened to it on audiobook, but I of course had to have a copy because I really liked it. This does several different things. It basically talks about how language is constructed. So, how it changes through time. We get little pockets of history focused on certain linguistic things. And a big part of her thesis is talking about who are the people that are innovating language. And a lot of the time, it's minorities, it's younger people, especially women, people of color. And I think that a lot of we can see this happen in real time really well, especially with the way that technology has gone, because we can see the way that different people talk and what things end up, I don't want to say trending because I feel like that's maybe not the correct word, but that's what the one that I have. I think especially the way that people co-opt AAVE sometimes not even really knowing. So she
And sorry, what was that phrase? Co-opting what?
AAVE, African American.
African American Vernacular English. Oh, right. Okay.
Mhm.
Gotcha. Yep.
But a lot of what she focuses on the book does look at women in language and the particulars of she goes through a lot of different studies. She pulls from a lot of different things to talk about how language is innovated. And also I think this is going to be an interesting read for people who are familiar with linguistics, certainly, but the way that she writes is very good for people who aren't super knowledgeable as well. Like, this is a good introduction to the idea of language prescriptivism and like the pitfalls of that.
Okay.
So kind of she actually in part talks about the history of how we got the idea of like good English and how before we had kind of a standardized English, it was standard to have certain texts in like Latin and stuff like that, which we can see, I think, remnants of in certain like Catholic churches, for instance, who still hold the Bible in Latin and so forth. But once they started to focus it more on English, there were certain ways of speaking that were seen as like better than others. And a lot of that's divided up on class lines, and that comes up a lot as well. I think some of the more common ones are people complaining about, people dropping the G from things ending in ing and stuff like that because it's more associated with the lower class. So there's a lot in
Great.
here.
I just would like to take a moment before we go any further to talk. You used a big word that I understand, but I'm going to explain it for other people that might not know it. Prescriptivist or prescriptivism. When you're talking about linguistics or especially grammar and spelling and punctuation, all that stuff, prescriptivists, they are very much about the rules, so that there are rules that must be followed, and that anything that's outside of that is bad or inferior. Whereas the other side, the more modern people, and have been moving gradually over my career as an ESL teacher to this other camp, is descriptivists who describe how language functions in the world and doesn't worry about rules because rules are always in flux. So that's the kind of polarity there. And And it sounds like this author comes down firmly on the side of the descriptivist camp in terms of this is how people speak in the world today. So we should celebrate it and study it and not judge it or correct it.
Yeah, definitely.
Tell us a little bit about what drew you to this book. Is it
Um,
something that is related to your work or just your bookish personality or?
yeah, well, I'd kind of seen it in the store. I currently work at a bookstore and I end up working with a lot of the nonfiction. So I kept seeing it, which is, one of the things that'll get you. But I also have a background in English. So my bachelor's is in English. My master's is in sociology. And part of my thesis was kind of around language usage, particularly in the queer community, focusing on trans people who use basically terminology that's outside of your basic LGBT. And so I looked at how people were using these kind of newer words as well as the importance of things like pronouns. So I have a little bit of a linguistic background, and this would have most definitely been something that I would have had to mention in my thesis had it been written several years earlier, especially because they do talk about pronouns at the end of the book.
You have already said that if you have a background in linguistics, the book would kind of resonate for you, but that it's not necessary to have one.
I think that it is accessible for people who are interested in learning more because she doesn't, like, there's not a whole lot of like technical language. I think the author teaches linguistics at the University of Nevada. So she comes from that background, but she actually talks in the book about how she tried to make this something that, everyday people could read and understand, especially because I think that we have a lot of these sort of arguments or discussions about language every day, even though most people aren't language scholars, they still, just like the word like or something like
That's
that.
right. So I think it might be fun. Tell me if you agree. Why don't you read us the first 2 or 3 sentences from chapter 1, just so people can hear the diction, the language, to see whether it's the kind of writing style that would be engaging for them.
The titles of everything, it's very like intentionally very interesting titles that will definitely be dated in 5 years, but that's kind of
Okay.
the intention. So the introduction, I hate when you say that. You have reached the end of your utility as a linguistic role model when your teenage son sighs as you explain the merits of using will instead of going to express future tense. And then he nonchalantly dismisses your wizened wisdom with, okay, boomer. He, for better or worse, has begun the timeless rite of passage known as adolescence. While perhaps the delivery of his message lacked diplomacy, he was on to something. It turns out that skin isn't the only thing that sags with age. Our linguistic elasticity takes a serious hit as well.
Okay, well, see, I think that's lovely writing. That may not appeal to everyone, but it's certainly not academese. It's using
Mhm.
some $64 words that I thought were quite appropriately chosen, but it does have kind of a zing to it. Yeah.
Mhm.
And it sounds like, even just looking at the title, that it's more focused on spoken English rather than written. Is that right?
Mhm. Yes, definitely. I think you could have a whole other, huge book about written English.
I recently read a book about the semicolon that was written by a professor and written in a similar breezy style that I found absolutely fascinating. But of course, we don't use semicolons when we talk. So is Valerie Fridland actually reclaiming these words in our speech, or celebrating, or telling us not we shouldn't worry about them, like, literally, and dude?
She does talk about each one of them in terms of the history of them a little bit and also how they're used in different ways, because I think most people, for instance, when someone is complaining about like, it's very vague, like, oh, people say that so much. But she actually goes through and talks about, well, this is why we use them. Same thing for vocal fillers, like and and she actually talks about the fact that there are, as much as they're filling dead space in one way or another, they also have actual functions similar to words in some instances, or like a verbal punctuation in some cases.
Okay, so I want to dial in on this one. Do you edit out your ums in your videos?
I do a lot. I'm
So do I.
self-conscious because I feel like I use them a lot, and sometimes it takes me a really long time to process what I'm thinking, and there's a lot of back and forth that uh ends up going on a lot of the time.
So yes, I edit out almost all of my ums, but just like what you alluded to, or that she is getting at, sometimes the is rhetorical and serves a function, and I don't edit those out. Like if I'm surprised by something, I don't edit those ums out. But when I'm just kind of idiotically grasping for words like the or he, and I say an before it, those are I take those out because those aren't serving any purpose. They're just showing what an airhead I am that particular day. But yeah, so hmm. And I'm over the literally thing. People use literally when they mean figuratively. President Biden being one of the many. And I don't have a problem with that. And dude, why do people not like that word? Is it because they use it for for women as well, or what?
Um, I think that, it's seen as a younger person, like kind of like disrespectful or silly in some sort of way. But in this, first of all, she goes through the history of dude, and it actually began as an insult for men who were basically effeminate, like they like cared about the way that they dressed, and like a dude was fancy in like a negative way.
Yeah, I was
And then
thinking
it's
dude as
evolved
being
over
kind of
time.
macho cowboy or something.
Yeah. Yeah, that's how it's evolved. And she also talks so how it's evolved to mean something completely different, and then now it's more commonplace to use, dude when referring to like anyone, not necessarily a guy, although it still kind of has those masculine connotations.
Well, I'm not going to call you dude, but I am going to say that this conversation was like literally awesome. So I hope you'll come back and chat about another book later.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me. This was fun.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to welcome a new guest on the Bite Size Book Tip series, but somebody who has already been on my channel once, and hopefully the first and second appearances of many more in the future. Please welcome Nora, joining us from Dublin, and the fabulous, very, very bookish, very spinster-inflected, bookish bookstagram account, Pear Jelly, Nora from Dublin. Hello, Nora.
Hi, Sean. Thank you so much for having me again. Such a pleasure.
It's so great to have you. And we are here to talk about a novella that's been in bookish news lately and made quite a splash when it came out in 2017. I've been hearing about it since then. It is the Palestinian novel Minor Detail by Adania. Is that right? Adania?
Adania Shibli. Yeah.
By Adania Shibli and translated from the Arabic by Elisabeth Jaquette. I haven't gotten to this one yet, and so that was a great reason to have you come on and sell me even further on it. Tell us about this book now.
This book is a book that is divided in two parts. So it's the first part is set in the summer of 1949, and we follow an Israeli soldier with his platoon as he's trying to secure the area near the Egyptian border in the Negev desert. It's just after 1948, after the Nakba, after the major displacement, the Palestine War. So he's trying to make sure that the area is Arab free, basically, so they can proceed with settlements. So that's the first part. We follow him and they're patrolling the area. And while they're patrolling, they stumble upon a tribe of Bedouins and they kill them all, bar a young girl, which they kidnap and bring back to the military camp. And there they rape her, the whole platoon. And after that, they kill her and discard her body. So that's the first part. And then the second part, we are in present time in Palestine. And our narrator this time is a Palestinian journalist, a woman, and she reads an article about what happened in that summer of 1949. And she sort of gets obsessed about that story. She feels like there's more to investigate. and we follow her through her investigation. And through following her, it's a great insight into what it's like for a Palestinian person to live and just move, like the little freedom of movement they have, how everything seems to be an administrative nightmare, the permits, the checkpoints. When she investigates that case, she realizes that she needs to go to Israel, where the scene of the crime is located. So it's a bit difficult for her to get there, but she manages. That's pretty much the gist of the story.
So, do you know if it's based on a historical incident?
Yeah, it's actually, I think you can access the article in question
Okay.
on the Haaretz
Okay.
Israel newspaper
So
on the website.
it's
Not,
definitely based on a true tragedy. In the first section, the story is told through the perspective of the Israeli soldiers.
yes, that's right.
And
And
how was that point of view managed? Like, was it a black and white? Like, what? I'm just curious about what kind of nuance there might be. I mean, it's hard to think about nuance when people are committing such horrible crimes, but I'm just curious how that's handled.
well, that's the thing that is really interesting about this book is the tone of those two parts are really different. When we follow that soldier or that sergeant, the tone is very cold. The narrative is from the third person, and we kept at a distance from him because it's a third narrative person. We know his action, but we don't always understand why he's doing things. Like at some stage, he gets bitten by a spider, and at no moment, even though his camp has a medical team, he goes to the medical team to check the bite, and his bite festers. So we sort of follow him as he does his patrolling and his living. He's very ritualistic. He does the same actions over and over again. He washes himself, he dresses, is very like military. So yeah, there's a coldness to that part of the story. And when it gets to that horrible scene, there's also that coldness. It's horrible to read, like major trigger warning, but we see it from his point of view. So there's like a distance that we're feeling that towards that action that is exacting. And then the second part is told from a first person narrative. Actually, I don't know if I can show you that's the first part, and you see it's paragraphs. So things are really like orderly. I think that's the word. And then the second part is like a stream of consciousness. And you're really in the head of that Palestinian woman. She tells you her feelings, you're feeling her anxiety. It's told from a first person narrative. I don't know if I said that already. And at some stage as well, she breaks the fourth wall. She tells us, if you want me to read a passage.
Sure, good idea.
So it's first person narrative, but as I said, she breaks the fourth wall and she talks directly to us, and she says, "By the way, I hope I didn't cause any awkwardness when I mentioned the incident with the soldier, or the checkpoint, or when I revealed that we are living under occupation here. Gunshots and military vehicles, sirens, and sometimes the sound of helicopters, warplanes, and shelling, the subsequent wail of ambulances. Not only do these noises precede breaking news reports, but now they have to compete with the dogs barking too." So as you see, there's like a closeness with the reader with that one.
Why did you, and would you use the verb like or love? Why did you like this novel? Let me put it that way and see how you answer.
Yeah. Well, first there was a novel that I was worried about reading it. I think I heard about it around maybe 2022, 2021. I think it was selected for the Booker International longlisted or something. And I remember, I think it was Jen Campbell talking about it. And when she mentioned, the sexual violence in it, I was like, oh, I don't know if I would be able to read that. That sounds really rough. but then on top of that, the fact that the prize ceremony got cancelled, I find that quite unfair that happened to her.
Insult to injury.
I thought, okay, I am gonna go past my fears, and I really want to support her, because I mean, it's awful what's happening. What I'm trying to say is that I came to it sort of in an apprehensive way, but I really connected to the text. There's something really special about it. As I said, the sort of contrast between the coldness of the first part and then how you're diving in the thoughts of that journalist. That really spoke to me. There's a beauty to the text. She uses repetitive motifs here, the way the wind blows, the gestures of the narrators, the camels, the plants. There's motifs repeating there, and that gives to the text a music, a beat, and you feel like something bad is happening. It's like a gut punch. It's both a gut punch. It's something that just grabs you, and you feel like, okay, something is happening here. There's something visceral, I think, about this book. I think that's the reason why I love it. And also, it's a haunting book. I mean, in the context of where we are now, obviously this book is going to be haunting, but she really tells a story in a way that is clever on so many levels, and that makes you empathize.
Well, it sounds like it's a really important book, timely to read it now, and it's the complete opposite of a comfort read.
Yeah. Do you mind if I make a tangent? Like a tiny tangent. There's something about that book that really spoke to me. I don't know if you read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Not yet.
Not yet? Oh, you have to. Well, this book, it's one of these books that just changed my life and changed my way of seeing things. And I think about it almost daily. One of the things that changed my mindset is that Robin Wall Kimmerer explains here that when things went wrong on an environmental point of view, is not the Industrial Revolution, as obviously that was pretty bad, but it's when people were disconnected from the land, when our relationship to the land ended, whether it was because Indigenous people were killed or even daily life. We don't really have a connection to the land. People living a lot in cities and all that. So the whole connection to the land have been on my mind a lot during the conflict as well. But also in this book, I think she very subtly talk about it, and that's something that I find that really interesting. In the first part, the Israeli sergeant does a little speech to his platoon, and he says that he wants the Israeli to have control of that land because they'll make something more valuable with that land. They will have more houses and people can live there, and then they can also make the land more productive instead of leaving it as the desert and with those shrubberies and those camels and tribes. And they think that the way the Arab treats the lands is very unproductive. So I found that really interesting. And in the second part, as we follow our unnamed narrator, the journalist, we see through our eyes how that land have changed, what they did with that land in Israel. And now, instead of those thorny shrubs that were everywhere in the desert and how the land is supposed to be, now you have those sort of gated communities that are half empty because they're like holiday houses. And then you have loads of eucalyptus, which is, I don't know if you know about eucalyptus, but it's an invasive plant. And those sort of monoculture groves of mangoes, bananas, and avocados. And if you know anything about monoculture, it's quite bad, quite intensive for the land. So she doesn't really put a highlight on that, but she does give those details that tells a story about the land and how people perceive that land. And I find it really interesting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It sounds like she literally grounds the story in the land. Yeah. Thank you so much for telling us about the book, Nora.
Well, thank you for giving me that space. I I'm so delighted to be able to talk about this book with you.